Welcome to the dark truth behind the neon lights. They were the most beautiful couple in Hollywood, yet their hands were stained with the blood of a dozen men. History calls Bugsy Siegel and Virginia Hill the Romeo and Juliet of the mob, but that is a lie. Romeo didn't build a gambling empire in the desert, and Juliet didn't steal millions from the Mafia. He was a sociopath desperate for applause. She was a bagman who saw through his act. This wasn't a love story. It was a death pact signed in neon, a glamorous collision of vanity and greed that turned the Las Vegas sand into a graveyard. And at the center of this graveyard stood a man of terrifying contradictions. Benjamin Siegel was a sociopath with a vision. Born in the slums of New York, he was a founding member of Murder Inc., the enforcement arm of the national crime syndicate. He had killed men with guns, knives, and his bare hands. But Siegel suffered from a fatal flaw for a gangster. He had vanity. He didn't want to be a thug. He wanted to be a celebrity. He moved to Hollywood in the late 1930s not just to run rackets, but to be seen. He befriended movie stars like George Raft and Cary Grant. He hosted garden parties where he charmed the wives of studio executives, hiding the killer behind a dazzling smile and a blue silk tie. He was a man performing a role, desperate for the legitimate world to applaud him. Virginia Hill was the only person who saw through the performance. She was not an actress. She was not a socialite. She was a bagman, a trusted courier for the Chicago outfit. Born into dirt-poor misery in Alabama, she had clawed her way up the criminal ladder using the only weapon she had, her beauty and her silence. She carried millions of dollars in cash across state lines for Al Capone's lieutenants. She sat in rooms where men discussed murder, and she filed her nails, listening to every word, remembering every debt. When they met in the early 1940s, it wasn't romance. It was recognition. Siegel looked at Virginia and saw a female version of himself, ruthless, ambitious, and utterly devoid of fear. Virginia looked at Siegel and saw the ultimate mark, a man so obsessed with his own reflection that he was blind to the knife in his back. Their relationship did not operate on affection. It operated on adrenaline. They were adrenaline junkies before the term existed. Normal life bored them, peace bored them. To feel alive, they needed chaos, and when the world didn't provide it, they manufactured it between themselves. For Benjamin Siegel and Virginia Hill, silence was not a comfort. It was a vacuum that needed to be filled with noise, with danger, and with intensity. They were creatures of the extreme. Two predators who had swum through the murky depths of poverty and violence to reach the surface. And now that they were basking in the California sun, they found the tranquility of legitimate life suffocating. They treated their romance not as a sanctuary, but as a high-stakes gambling table where every emotional chip was pushed to the center. They were addicted to the chemical rush of the fight, the physiological spike of terror, and the euphoric release of survival. A quiet dinner at home was torture. A screaming match that ended with shattered glass was just a Tuesday night. They were the killer couple of Hollywood. They drove a convertible Cadillac through the streets of Los Angeles, ignoring traffic laws, screaming at police officers, throwing money at the problem when they were pulled over. They were flashy, loud, and impossible to ignore. They treated Sunset Boulevard like their personal racetrack, weaving through traffic with a reckless disregard for human life that signaled their untouchable status. When the sirens wailed behind them, Siegel wouldn't pull over with humility. He would stop the car, step out in his bespoke suit, and confront the officers with a mixture of charm and menace. He didn't pay fines. He handed out rolls of cash like he was tipping a valet, buying the law just as he bought his silk shirts. To the starstruck LAPD officers, often on the take or simply terrified of the syndicate's reach, pulling over Bugsy Siegel wasn't an enforcement of the law. It was a brush with a dark kind of royalty. But behind the closed doors of their rented mansions, the dynamic was a war zone. The public performance of the glamorous power couple evaporated the moment the lock clicked shut. In the privacy of their Beverly Hills estate, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like static electricity waiting for a spark. Their home was not a domestic nest, it was an arena. Violence was their foreplay. At the majestic parties they hosted, witnesses would watch in horror as the arguments escalated. It usually started with something trivial, a glance at another woman, a comment about a dress, a drink spilled. These small infractions were merely the matches lit near the powder keg of their collective neuroses. The tension would snap. Virginia, fueled by gin and a temper that rivaled Siegel's, would launch a heavy crystal ashtray at his head. It wasn't a playful toss. It was a projectile meant to maim. Virginia Hill did not fight like a lady. She fought like a street brawler who had learned early that the first person to draw blood wins. She would scream profanities that made hardened mobsters blush, tearing into Siegel with a ferocity that defied her perfectly coiffed appearance. Siegel, a man who had stared down armed hitmen without blinking, would not retreat. He would engage. He would slap her. He would grab her by the hair. They would brawl, physically destroying the expensive furniture they had bought to impress their neighbors. Lamps were smashed, sending shards of porcelain skittering across the polished floors. Tables were overturned, spilling expensive scotch into the Persian rugs. Screams echoed down the hallways of their Beverly Hills estate, a cacophony of rage that terrified the servants and froze the guests in their tracks. To an outsider, it looked like attempted murder. To Siegel and Hill, it was a twisted form of communication. They were testing each other's thresholds, pushing the boundaries of physical safety to see if the other would break. Siegel needed to prove his dominance. Virginia needed to prove she couldn't be tamed. But then the switch would flip. The violence released the pressure valve. The rage turned into lust. They would retreat to the bedroom, leaving the guests in the wreckage of the living room, and the sounds of fighting would turn into the sounds of passionate reconciliation. The transition was instantaneous and terrifyingly seamless. The adrenaline that fueled the fistfight was the same fuel that drove their intimacy. The pain validated the pleasure. They would emerge hours later, bruised and disheveled, acting as if the destruction in the living room had never happened. This was a toxic cycle of abuse, but for two narcissists, it was the only way they could connect. Siegel couldn't be with a submissive woman. He would get bored and crush her. He had plenty of good girls in his past, women who nodded, obeyed, and looked pretty on his arm. He despised them. They offered no reflection for his massive ego. He needed friction. He needed a challenge. Virginia couldn't be with a weak man. She would manipulate and discard him. She had spent her life using men as stepping stones, extracting their wealth and moving on before they realized they had been played. A normal man, a kind man, was prey to her. Siegel was the only one she couldn't fully conquer, and that made him irresistible. They needed the resistance. They needed the fight. Psychologically, Virginia held the power. Siegel was the physical threat, the man with the reputation as a killer, but Virginia was the one who could hurt him emotionally. She held the keys to his fragile self-worth. She knew his insecurities better than he knew them himself. She knew that beneath the tailored suits, the manicures, and the elocution lessons, Ben Siegel was terrified that he was still just a street rat from Williamsburg. She knew he was desperate to be respected as a businessman and terrified of being seen as a hoodlum. She played on this like a virtuoso pianist. In public, she would mock him. She would dismantle his carefully constructed persona with surgical precision. She would call him Benny, a name he loathed, just to see his jaw tighten. He had banned the name Bugsy under threat of death, and he hated Benny because it sounded childish, common, and undignified. Virginia used it as a whip. She would flirt with other men right in front of him, testing the limits of his control. She would lean in close to a producer or an actor, laughing a little too loudly at their jokes, casting a sidelong glance at Siegel to ensure he was watching. She was baiting the monster, daring him to snap, proving to the room that she was the only person alive who didn't fear the Reaper. One famous incident occurred at a dinner party at Xero's nightclub. The setting was the epitome of Hollywood glamour: velvet banquettes, cigarette smoke curling in the spotlight, the clinking of crystal glasses. Siegel was holding court, telling a story, trying to impress a table of producers. He was in his element, charming the elite, playing the role of the benevolent patron. He was speaking of business, of vision, trying to sound like a mogul rather than a mobster. Virginia, drunk and bored, interrupted him. She didn't just interrupt, she annihilated him. She insulted his intelligence. She made a crack about his big ideas being nothing but hot air. She leaned across the table, her eyes glassy with alcohol and malice, and loudly proclaimed that he didn't know what he was talking about, that he was just a thug playing dress-up. The table went silent. People stopped chewing. You did not insult Bugsy Siegel. Men had been buried in the Nevada desert for less. The ambient noise of the nightclub seemed to drop away, leaving only the terrified heartbeats of the guests. Every person at that table knew Siegel's history. They knew about Murder, Inc. They knew about the bodies. They expected him to reach into his jacket, pull out a gun, and end the evening in blood. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. They looked from Virginia's defiant face to Siegel's freezing stare, waiting for the explosion. Siegel turned to her. His face was a mask of fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. The humiliation was total. She had stripped him naked in front of the very people he was trying to impress. But he didn't kill her. He didn't order his men to take her outside. He stared at her, his blue eyes icy, and she stared right back, daring him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She offered him her throat metaphorically and dared him to bite. And he laughed. He broke the tension with a terrifying hollow laugh and kissed her on the mouth. It was a laugh that chilled the spine, a sound that acknowledged the insanity of their bond. It was a recognition that she was the only creature on earth crazy enough to stand toe-to-toe with him. "She's a firecracker," he told the table. "Keeps me honest." The guests laughed nervously, exhaling the breath they had been holding. But the dynamic had been laid bare. It wasn't love. It was a hostage situation where both hostages had fallen in love with their captor. Virginia was the only person on earth who could slap Bugsy Siegel and live. And Siegel was the only man dangerous enough to keep Virginia interested. This volatile energy needed a target, or it would consume them both. Siegel needed a project. He needed something grand, something that would cement his legacy as a visionary, not just a thug. He was tired of being the muscle. He wanted to be the architect. He wanted to build a kingdom where he was not just the enforcer but the king. He looked east, past the California border, into the dust and heat of Nevada. Las Vegas in 1945 was nothing. It was a highway stop, a few sawdust joints, a few motels, and miles of nothing but scrub brush and scorpions. It was a place people drove through to get somewhere else, a scorched purgatory of cheap liquor and cheaper rooms. The heat was oppressive, the wind was relentless, and the only things that seemed to thrive were the coyotes and the desperation. But Siegel saw something else. He saw a legal sanctuary. He saw a place where gambling was sanctioned by the state, where the mob could operate in the daylight. He looked at the barren wasteland and hallucinated an oasis. He imagined a skyline that didn't exist, a place where the illicit activities of the East Coast could be wrapped in neon and sold as legitimate entertainment on the West Coast. He muscled his way into a project called the Flamingo, originally the dream of Billy Wilkerson, the founder of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson was a sophisticated man with a taste for the finer things, and he had envisioned a European-style casino in the desert. But Wilkerson had a gambling problem and a cash flow problem. Siegel smelled the weakness like a shark smells blood in the water. He didn't ask to be a partner. He informed Wilkerson that he was now involved. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a rescue mission. Siegel saw it as his own ticket to legitimacy. He pushed Wilkerson to the sidelines, taking control of the construction, the design, and the checkbook. It became an obsession. Legend says he named it after Virginia. Her nickname was the Flamingo because of her long, thin legs, though others say the name was there before she arrived. Regardless, the hotel became his love letter to her and his monument to himself. It was to be the physical manifestation of their shared vanity, flashy, expensive, and completely out of place in the rugged environment. He pitched the idea to the syndicate. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's childhood friend and the financial wizard of the mob, was skeptical. Lansky was a man of ledgers and logic. He looked at the desert and saw zero return on investment. But he loved Ben. They had risen from the gutter together, protecting each other when no one else would. He convinced the bosses, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, the Chicago outfit, to invest. He sold them on the idea of a monopoly, a virgin territory waiting to be conquered. They put up $1 million. It was a seed investment for what they assumed would be a straightforward construction job. They had no idea they were funding a catastrophe. Siegel and Hill moved their chaotic circus to Las Vegas. They stood in the sand wearing designer clothes pointing at the empty horizon. The image was absurd. A gangster in a silk suit and a mall in high heels standing amidst the cactus, dictating orders to confused laborers. "We're going to build the greatest resort on earth," Siegel declared. "We're going to import palm trees. We're going to have air conditioning in every room. We're going to have the best food, the best liquor, the best entertainment." He spoke with the manic intensity of a prophet. He wasn't just building a hotel. He was terraforming the desert. Virginia stood beside him, nodding. But while Siegel was looking at the clouds, Virginia was looking at the checkbook. She saw the potential for a different kind of empire, one built not on concrete, but on larceny. Here lies the crux of the betrayal. Siegel was the dreamer, but he was a terrible businessman. He had no concept of cost. He wanted the best, regardless of the price. He treated the syndicate's money as if it were an infinite resource. He ordered imported marble from Italy, demanding it be shipped across an ocean and a continent to a construction site that didn't even have a paved road. When it arrived broken, he didn't file an insurance claim. He ordered it again, doubling the cost. He changed the designs daily. He would walk through a framed-out room, decide he didn't like the feng shui, and order the workers to tear it down and start over. He demanded copper piping, during a post-war shortage, paying black market prices that would have made even a corrupt contractor blush. The budget began to swell. $1 million became two. Two became three. The desert was swallowing the money as fast as the trucks could deliver it. Siegel was drowning in logistics, screaming at contractors, threatening architects with death if the lobby wasn't finished on time. He was manic, driven by the fear of failure. He began to suffer from the delusion that he knew more about building than the engineers. He fired reputable contractors and hired yes-men. He personally supervised the installation of the plumbing, the wiring, the escape tunnels he insisted be built under the presidential suite. He was a conductor trying to lead an orchestra while the theater was burning down. Virginia Hill saw the chaos, and she saw an opportunity. She realized that in the midst of this administrative hurricane, no one was watching the details. Siegel was too obsessed with the idea of the hotel to track the reality of the invoices. She was the bag man. She controlled the flow of cash. Siegel trusted her implicitly. He was too busy playing the role of the construction foreman to watch the ledger. He handed her the keys to the vault, believing she was his loyal lieutenant. This is where the love story turns into a heist movie. According to long-standing underworld lore, this is where Virginia began to siphon the money. It was a subtle, brilliant theft. She allegedly integrated the skimming into the dysfunctional workflow of the construction, inflating the costs of materials. If a shipment of velvet curtains cost $10,000, she wrote it down as $30,000 and pocketed the difference. She created fake invoices for companies that didn't exist, paying for services that were never rendered. But her masterpiece was the double buy. When a truckload of lumber arrived, she would pay for it with syndicate cash, have the driver unload it, and then, under the cover of night, have it driven out the back gate to a holding yard. The next day, the same truck would return with the same lumber, and she would buy it again. The syndicate was paying for the same materials 2-3 times. And where did the money go? It didn't go into the building. It went into shoe boxes. It went into hat boxes. It went into the false bottoms of Virginia's luggage. The Flamingo was bleeding to death, and Virginia was collecting the blood in a bucket. Virginia began taking shopping trips to Europe. She told Siegel she was going to Paris to buy tapestries, to Zurich to buy crystal chandeliers. She flew to Zurich. She flew to Paris. She wasn't just buying couture. She was depositing cash into numbered Swiss bank accounts. While Siegel was screaming at plumbers in the Nevada dust, Virginia was sitting in the cool, quiet bank vaults in Geneva, securing her future. Did Siegel know? This is the question that haunts historians. Was Bugsy Siegel a fool, blinded by love, or was he a co-conspirator? It seems impossible that a man who helped build the National Crime Syndicate, a man who knew every trick in the book, could be so blind to a theft happening under his own nose. There is a strong argument that Siegel did know. He knew the Flamingo was a gamble. He knew that if it failed, the mob would come for him. He knew the rules of the game better than anyone. Failure is not an option when you are playing with Lucky Luciano's money. He needed an exit strategy. He needed a runaway fund. He trusted Virginia to build their life raft. He thought that if the hotel collapsed or if the syndicate decided to cut their losses and remove him, they would take the money and flee to France, living out their days like exiled royalty. He made the classic mistake of a narcissist. He thought he was smarter than the system. He thought he could steal from Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, the smartest men in the history of crime, and get away with it because of their friendship. He believed his own legend. He believed he was the golden boy, the one who could walk through fire and not get burned. He underestimated the cold, hard arithmetic of the mob. And he underestimated Virginia Hill. He thought they were partners in crime. She knew she was a survivor in a shark tank. Virginia Hill became a living vault. She held the secrets, and she held the cash. As the budget for the Flamingo soared to a staggering $6 million, an astronomical sum in 1946, the pressure from the East Coast began to mount. The whispers in New York turned into shouts. Meyer Lansky called Siegel. The conversations were tense. "Benny, the boys are getting nervous," Lansky would say, his voice tight with the strain of defending the indefensible. "The costs are too high. Where's the money going? We're looking at the numbers, Ben, and they don't add up." "It's the desert, Meyer," Siegel would scream into the phone, the receiver slick with his sweat. "Everything costs triple out here. You have to trust me. I'm building a monument. Do you want a tent or do you want a palace?" He was pleading for his life, using bluster to cover his panic. Siegel was sweating. He was working 20-hour days. He was popping pills to stay awake, oscillating between manic energy and crushing depression. His temper was fraying. He beat up a contractor who looked at him wrong, breaking the man's jaw in front of the crew. He threatened to kill the chef because the soup was cold, waving a pistol in the kitchen. He was unraveling, a man possessed by a vision that was slowly killing him. Virginia, meanwhile, was cool as ice. She watched the panic in his eyes, and she kept packing the suitcases. She was calculating the odds. She knew how the mob worked. She knew that patience was finite. She saw the way Siegel shook when he hung up the phone with Lansky. She saw the doom written on the wall long before Siegel was willing to read it. She loved Siegel in her own twisted way, but she loved survival more. She had grown up starving in Alabama. She had sworn she would never be poor again. Poverty was a wolf at the door, and she had spent her entire life building barricades against it. If the ship was going down, she wasn't going to drown with the captain. She wasn't going to be the loyal wife waving from the deck as the water rose. She was going to be on the first lifeboat, and that lifeboat was made of stolen cash. But time was running out. Siegel needed the hotel to open immediately to pay back the syndicate. He insisted on a grand opening in December regardless of the cost, regardless of the weather. He needed a miracle to cover the theft. Instead, he got a storm. The rain in the Mojave Desert is not like rain elsewhere. It is an insult. It does not wash the world clean. It turns the dust into a suffocating paste that clings to everything. On the night of December 26, 1946, the heavens opened up over Las Vegas, dumping a torrent of water on the unfinished roof of the Flamingo Hotel. It was a deluge of biblical proportions, a meteorological freak event that felt like the desert itself was rejecting the foreign organ Siegel was trying to transplant into its body. The palm trees, imported at exorbitant cost, bent and snapped in the howling wind. The neon signs, meant to be beacons of a new civilization, sputtered and flickered against the gloom, their electrical hum drowned out by the thunder. Inside the lobby, the air conditioning units, which Bugsy Siegel had insisted upon despite the astronomical cost, rattled and coughed, spitting condensation onto the expensive tuxedos of the few Hollywood stars who had braved the weather to attend. The grand opening was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The atmosphere inside was not one of celebration, but of a damp, humid wake. The smell of wet wool mixed unpleasantly with the scent of fresh paint and sawdust. The casino floor, which was supposed to be the beating heart of the new empire, was half empty. The dealers stood behind their green felt tables, shuffling cards for ghosts, their eyes darting nervously toward the entrance, waiting for high rollers who would never arrive. The slot machines sat silent, their chrome levers gleaming under the harsh lights, waiting for coins that never came. Benjamin Siegel stood in the center of the room, his smile fixed in place like a rictus of panic. He was wearing his best suit, a midnight blue double-breasted number that cost more than the cars parked outside, but beneath the silk, he was sweating. The sweat wasn't just from the humidity. It was the cold, clammy perspiration of a man watching his own execution in slow motion. He was manic, his movements jerky and overly aggressive. He grabbed George Raft by the arm, parading the actor around the room like a show pony, desperate to prove to the investors that the glamour was real. "Look who's here," he would shout, his voice cracking slightly, trying to drown out the sound of the rain battering the roof. He was acting, but it was a terrible performance. The cracks in the facade were visible to everyone. He snapped at waiters, he glared at the few patrons who dared to look bored, and he checked his watch every 30 seconds. But the glamour was thin. It was a stage set seen from the wrong angle. The hotel rooms weren't finished. Guests had to step over drop cloths and buckets of paint to get to the bar. Wires hung from the ceiling like exposed nerves. The sound of construction hammers echoed in the hallways, a discordant rhythm to the jazz band playing in the lounge. It felt less like a coronation and more like a wake for a dream that had died in the womb. Siegel was trying to sell a fantasy, but the reality was leaking through the roof. Standing a few feet away, holding a glass of champagne that she had barely touched, was Virginia Hill. She looked magnificent in a white fur stole, diamonds dripping from her ears like frozen tears. But her eyes were not on the guests. Her eyes were scanning the room, counting the empty tables, calculating the losses in real time. She was not a dreamer like Ben. She was an operator. While Siegel was running on delusion, Virginia was operating on cold, hard arithmetic. She stood near a pillar, detached, watching Siegel's manic circulation with a look that was devoid of sympathy. It was the look of a predator evaluating a wounded mate, deciding whether to help him up or leave him to the wolves. She knew exactly what this disaster meant. It meant that the $6 million they had sunk into this concrete box in the desert was not going to be recouped. It meant that the syndicate, watching from New York and Havana, was going to start asking questions that had no good answers. In the quiet moments of that disastrous night, when their eyes met across the empty casino floor, there was no shared comfort. There was only the terrifying realization that their us against the world pact was crumbling. Siegel looked to her for reassurance, for the fire that usually fueled him, but he found only ice. Virginia was already mentally packing her bags. The failure of the opening night was the catalyst that turned a financial problem into a death sentence. In the weeks that followed, the Flamingo bled money. It lost tens of thousands of dollars a day. The high rollers didn't come. The locals didn't trust the slick Hollywood mobster. The casino was closed down after 2 weeks to finish construction, a humiliation that stung Siegel's vanity more than the financial loss. Those 2 weeks were a descent into hell for the couple. Trapped in the empty hotel, surrounded by the echoes of their failure, they turned on each other. Siegel, deprived of his audience and his success, became a tyrant. He screamed at Virginia, blaming her for the bad luck, for the distraction, for the weather. Virginia, in turn, retreated into a fortress of silence and sarcasm. She watched him unravel, noting every tremor in his hand, every pill he popped to stay awake. She wasn't just witnessing a business failure. She was witnessing the collapse of the man she had once thought was invincible. But while Siegel was running around screaming at contractors trying to fix the plumbing and the lighting, a much darker game was being played in the shadows. The silence from the East Coast was deceptive. It wasn't indifference, it was the quiet, before the strike. The syndicate's accountants began to look at the books. What they found was not just incompetence, it was larceny. The cost of the Flamingo had ballooned from a projected $1 million to $6 million. In today's currency, that is a cost overrun of nearly $100 million. Even in the mob, where money was printed in back rooms, that kind of discrepancy was impossible to ignore. In New York, Meyer Lansky sat staring at the ledgers, and the numbers painted a grim picture. He didn't need a forensic accountant to see the betrayal. The pattern was undeniable. The inflated costs, the disappearing shipments, the duplicate invoices, they all pointed to a hemorrhage of cash that couldn't be explained by mere incompetence. And every fiscal trail led to the same destination, the Swiss bank accounts of Virginia Hill. The mechanics of the betrayal were devastatingly clear to the men in New York. Siegel, blinded by his own arrogance and his belief in his brotherhood with Lansky, had treated the syndicate's treasury as his personal fund. But the ledgers told a different story. The money wasn't just being spent, it was disappearing. And every trail of missing cash seemed to lead back to one person, the woman making frequent, unexplained trips to Europe. It wasn't just that Siegel was letting her steal. It was that he was so besotted, so controlled by her, that he was allowing her to rob his own brothers. The syndicate could forgive a mistake. They could not forgive being played for fools by a woman. This was the love gamble. They were betting their lives on the idea that the Flamingo would eventually be so profitable that they could pay back the principal before anyone noticed the theft. They thought they could borrow from the cookie jar, win big at the track, and put the money back before Mom and Dad came home. But the Flamingo didn't win. It crashed. And now the jar was empty, and the parents were coming home with baseball bats. The reckoning began not in Las Vegas, but in Havana, Cuba. In late 1946, the heads of the American Mafia gathered at the Hotel Nacional for a summit that would define the future of organized crime. It was a gathering of kings. Lucky Luciano, the boss of bosses, had been deported to Italy but had secretly traveled to Cuba to preside over the meeting. Frank Costello was there. Vito Genovese was there, and Meyer Lansky was there. The air in the conference room was thick with cigar smoke and humidity. They discussed the narcotics trade, the unions, and the expansion into the West. But the elephant in the room was Benjamin Siegel. The atmosphere was heavy, not just with the tropical heat, but with the weight of fratricide. These men had grown up together, bled together, and risen from the gutter together. But business was business, and Siegel had violated the cardinal rule. He had put his ego and his woman above the family. Luciano, a man whose eyes were as cold and dead as a shark's, put the question on the table. "Where is the money, Meyer?" he asked. $6 million for a tent in the desert. His voice was low, devoid of anger, which made it all the more terrifying. He wasn't asking a question. He was stating an indictment. Lansky tried to defend his friend. He argued that Ben was a visionary, that the costs were high because of the post-war shortages, that the hotel would eventually be a gold mine. He pleaded for patience. He invoked the bonds of their childhood on the Lower East Side, the blood they had spilled together to build the syndicate. He tried to sell them the dream that Siegel was selling him, that the Flamingo was just growing pains, not a terminal illness. "Give him time," Lansky urged, his voice trembling slightly, a rare show of emotion for the mob's accountant. "Benny will make it right." But the other bosses were not swayed by sentimentality. They saw disrespect. They saw a man who was preening for the cameras in Hollywood while spending their money on his girlfriend. They laid out the evidence of Virginia Hill's trips to Switzerland, They knew about the bank accounts. They knew about the skimming. To them, Siegel wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a cuckold who was letting a woman pick the pockets of the Mafia. "He's stealing from us, Meyer," Luciano said, his voice quiet and lethal. "He's stealing from you, and he's letting that girl run the show." The vote was taken. It was a democratic process of execution. The bosses voted to kill Bugsy Siegel. Meyer Lansky, heartbroken and cornered, was forced to abstain. He could not vote to kill his brother, but he could not save him. The contract was issued. The date was left open, pending one final chance. They would wait to see if the Flamingo could turn a profit when it reopened in March. If it made money, Siegel might live. If it failed again, the contract would be fulfilled. Back in Beverly Hills, Siegel was oblivious to the sword hanging over his head. Or perhaps he refused to see it. He was consumed by the reopening. In March 1947, the Flamingo opened its doors for the second time. This time, the weather held. The construction was finished. The hotel was spectacular. It was an oasis of neon and velvet in the middle of the wasteland. And miraculously, it began to make money. The gamblers came. The profits started to trickle in. By May, the Flamingo was showing a profit of $250,000 a month. Siegel was ecstatic. He called Lansky, crowing about his success. "I told you, Meyer. I told you it was a gold mine." His arrogance returned, amplified by the relief of success. He began to strut again. He told people he was the king of Las Vegas. He stopped returning calls from the lower-level mobsters. He treated the syndicate representatives with disdain. He believed he had won the gamble. He believed he had outsmarted the Reaper, but he had forgotten the theft. The profit was good, but it didn't cover the millions that were missing, and he had forgotten Virginia Hill. The relationship between Bugsy and Virginia had deteriorated from passionate chaos into pure toxicity. The stress of the failing opening and the looming shadow of the syndicate turned their home into a prison of paranoia. The fights were no longer about adrenaline. They were about survival. Siegel, terrified and cornered, saw traitors in every shadow, including the woman sleeping beside him. Virginia, realizing the ship was sinking, knew she had to abandon the captain to save herself. She saw the way Siegel was unraveling, his eyes darting around the room, his hands shaking until he had a drink. She realized that he was a sinking ship. The pivotal moment came in early June 1947. A fight broke out in their Beverly Hills mansion that was so violent the neighbors called the police. Furniture was smashed. Clothes were thrown onto the lawn. Virginia screamed that she was leaving. She screamed that Siegel was a washed-up has-been who was going to get them both killed. Siegel, in a rage, told her to get out. This was the break Virginia had been waiting for. It was the excuse she needed to trigger the escape plan. She packed her bags. Not just a weekend bag, but everything. She took her furs. She took her jewelry. The diamonds Siegel had bought her with stolen money. She took the ledger books that contained the codes to the Swiss bank accounts. On June 16, 1947, 4 days before the murder, Virginia Hill boarded a plane to Paris. Was it a flight of passion? A lover's quarrel gone wrong? History suggests otherwise. It was a tactical retreat. There is a persistent theory in the Underworld lore that Meyer Lansky, in a final act of mercy for his old friend's lover, tipped her off. A phone call in the middle of the night, a few words spoken in Yiddish or code. "The weather is getting bad in Los Angeles. You should go to Europe." Virginia, who had survived the shark tanks of Chicago and New York, didn't need to be told twice. She knew what bad weather meant. It meant a storm of lead. She looked at Bugsy Siegel one last time. Did she feel a pang of regret? Did she feel love? Or did she see a dead man walking? She chose the pragmatic path. She chose life. She chose the money. She boarded the plane, leaving Ben alone in the mansion, alone with his delusions of grandeur, alone with the hit squad that was already sharpening its knives. Her departure sealed Siegel's fate. Without Virginia, he was isolated. He had no one to watch his back. He had no access to the emergency funds hidden in Zurich. He was a king without a treasury, a general without an army. He sat in the mansion on North Linden Drive, reading the newspaper, waiting for a future that had already been canceled. The tragedy of Bugsy Siegel is not that he died. Men like him always die violently. The tragedy is that he died believing he had won. He sat on that sofa on the night of June 20th, thinking about the profits from the Flamingo, thinking about how he would expand the hotel, thinking about how he would win Virginia back. He was planning a future in a world that had already erased him. When the rifle fired, it didn't just kill a man, it killed the era of the celebrity gangster. It killed the idea that a criminal could be a movie star. The mob learned its lesson from Bugsy Siegel. After him, they went underground. They became faceless corporate entities. They realized that fame was not an asset. It was a target. On the night of June 20th, 1947, the clock finally ran out. Siegel sat on the floral sofa, reading the newspaper, unguarded and defiant to the end. But outside in the darkness, the syndicate's judgment was waiting. At 10:45 p.m., the sniper fired. There were no last words. There was no bargaining. In a split second, the Prince of Las Vegas was erased from the board. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The scene they found was a grotesque tableau of the American dream gone wrong. The room was opulent, a testament to wealth and success, but in the center of it sat a corpse that had been butchered. The contrast was nauseating. The expensive suit, the manicured nails, the gold ring, all of it was stained with the visceral reality of death. The detectives noted the brutality of the headshots. In the underworld, shooting a man in the chest is business. Shooting a man in the face, destroying his identity, obliterating his vanity, is a message. It was a public execution designed to humiliate the victim, even in death. But while the flashbulbs of the police photographers were popping in Beverly Hills, a second, more significant event was taking place 300 miles away in the Nevada desert. At approximately 11 p.m., shortly after Siegel's heart stopped beating, 3 men walked into the lobby of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. They were Mo Sedway, Gus Greenbaum, and Morris Rosen. They were not tourists. They were associates of Meyer Lansky and the syndicate. They did not carry guns. They carried briefcases. They walked up to the front desk with the calm authority of men who already owned the building. They asked to speak to the manager. When the manager appeared, confused and nervous, Mo Sedway didn't raise his voice. He simply stated a fact. "Ben Siegel is dead," Sedway said. "We are taking over." There was no resistance. There were no phone calls to check the story. In the pre-digital age, news traveled slowly. But in the mob, bad news traveled at the speed of light. The staff of the Flamingo, the dealers, the pit bosses, the bartenders, knew instantly that the regime had changed. They didn't mourn Siegel. They didn't stop dealing cards. They simply nodded and went back to work. The king of Las Vegas had been deposed, and the corporation had installed a new board of directors before the body was even cold. This synchronization reveals the terrifying efficiency of the murder. It proves that this was not a crime of passion. It was a hostile takeover. The hit in Beverly Hills and the walk-in at Las Vegas had been coordinated to the minute. The syndicate knew that Siegel's death would create a power vacuum, and they filled it instantly to prevent anyone else from seizing the assets. The Flamingo was too valuable to be left to the chaos of grief. It was an asset that needed to be managed. The funeral of Benjamin Siegel was the final crushing punchline to the joke of his life. He had spent 20 years curating an image of beloved celebrity. He had picked up check after check at Ciro's and the Trocadero. He had loaned money to actors who gambled it away and never paid him back. He had charmed the wives of studio heads. He believed, with the delusion of the narcissist, that he was the most popular man in Hollywood. But when the casket was lowered into the ground at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, the silence was deafening. There were no movie stars. There were no producers. There were no weeping starlets. Only 5 people stood by the grave: his brother, his sister, and 3 anxious relatives who looked over their shoulders, terrified that the syndicate might decide to shoot up the funeral just to make a point. George Raft, the actor who had mimicked Siegel's mannerisms to build his own career, stayed home. Virginia Hill, the woman who had helped him steal millions, stayed in Paris. Meyer Lansky, the man who loved him like a brother but authorized his execution, stayed in New York. Siegel died as he was born, a thug from the Lower East Side, discarded by the polite society he so desperately wanted to join. The Hollywood ending he had scripted for himself, the one where he retires as a legitimate tycoon, was rewritten by a sniper with a .30 caliber edit. Across the Atlantic, Virginia Hill was living a life that looked like freedom but felt like purgatory. The press called her the mob queen, but in reality she was a fugitive with a target on her back. She had the money. The millions she had skimmed from the Flamingo construction budget were sitting in Swiss accounts. But money is heavy when it's stained with blood. The syndicate knew she had it. They didn't kill her because she was smart enough to negotiate. She returned a significant chunk of the cash, a peace offering that bought her breath. But they stripped her of her status. She was no longer the bag man. She was just a loose end that hadn't been cut yet. She drifted through Europe like a ghost in couture. She lived in Paris, then Zurich, then Naples. She married a handsome Austrian ski instructor named Hans Hauser, a man who knew nothing of the Lower East Side or Murder, Inc. It was an attempt to buy normalcy. She had a son. She tried to play the role of the housewife in the Alps. But you cannot scrub the gunpowder off your soul with mountain air. The demons followed her. The IRS, unable to prosecute the dead Siegel for tax evasion, turned its full gaze on Virginia. They tracked her spending. They indicted her for income tax evasion, freezing her assets in the United States. She was trapped in Europe, an exile in her own life. The beauty that had been her weapon began to fade. The alcohol, which had once been a party accessory, became a crutch. She drank to forget the sound of the glass breaking in Beverly Hills. She drank to forget the look in Bugsy's eyes when she boarded that plane to Paris. By the mid-1960s, Virginia Hill was a tragedy waiting for a third act. She was living in Salzburg, Austria, far from the heat of the Mojave. She was broke. The Swiss accounts had been drained by blackmail, hush money, and the cost of running from the U.S. government. She was writing memoirs that she threatened to publish, a desperate card to play against the mob. "I know where the bodies are," she told reporters, trying to sell her story. But the mob didn't fear her anymore. They pitied her. Or perhaps they decided that a woman with a memory that sharp was too dangerous to keep around. On March 24, 1966, passers-by found a woman lying in a snowbank near a stream in Salzburg. She was dressed in casual clothes, not the furs of her glory days. She didn't look like the woman who had ordered champagne at the Copa. She looked tired. The official cause of death was an overdose of sleeping pills. It was ruled a suicide. The narrative was simple. The fading gangster moll, broke and depressed, took the easy way out. But in the underworld, suicide is often a euphemism. There were whispers. Why would she walk 2 miles into the snow to die? Why were there bruises on her body? Did the syndicate finally decide to close the file? Did Meyer Lansky, in his old age, decide that the last witness to the Flamingo theft needed to be silenced? Or was it simply the weight of the ghosts? Virginia Hill died at 49, the same age Siegel would have been had he lived a few more years. They were bound together not by a grave, but by a timeline of destruction. She was the bagman who survived the heist, but couldn't survive the getaway. The legacy of Bugsy Siegel and Virginia Hill is not written in history books. It is written in the skyline of Las Vegas. Today, the Flamingo is a corporate monolith. It is owned by a massive entertainment conglomerate. Families push strollers through the lobby where Siegel once paced, screaming at contractors. Tourists play slot machines themed after TV shows, standing on the spot where the mob bosses once plotted murders. The violence has been sanitized. The blood has been scrubbed out of the carpet and replaced with polyester. But if you look closely, the DNA of the monster is still there. Las Vegas is a city founded on the specific psychological defect that Siegel and Hill shared, the belief that you can beat the house. Every person who flies to Vegas is chasing the same delusion that killed Ben Siegel. They believe they are special. They believe they can defy the odds. They believe that if they just roll the dice one more time, they will win big and live forever. Siegel sold that dream, and he paid for it with his eye. Virginia Hill sold the illusion of glamour, and she paid for it with her life. They were the Adam and Eve of the Neon Garden, eating the forbidden fruit of organized crime, and they were cast out into the darkness so that the rest of us could come in and play. In the end, the desert reclaimed them both. Siegel is dust in a Hollywood cemetery, ignored by the stars he worshipped. Virginia's dust in an Austrian grave, forgotten by the gangsters she served. The only thing that remains is the Flamingo. It glows pink in the desert night, a tombstone the size of a city block, blinking its neon eyes at the millions of suckers who come to pay tribute to a dead man's greed. The house always wins. Ben Siegel thought he was the house. He was wrong. He was just another player who ran out of chips. The neon lights of the Flamingo still burn, but there are other shadows waiting to be explored. History is a graveyard of secrets, and we have only just begun to dig. If this journey into the underworld resonated with you, leave a like to keep the investigation alive. And if you are ready for the next chapter of dark history, make sure you are subscribed. Now I turn the question to you. Which fallen icon, which royal scandal, or which silent tragedy should we investigate next? The past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for us to dig it up. Tell me who to find in the comments below.